A quiet life in suburban bliss. The Miller family seemed like a quintessential middle-class American household living in the Detroit suburbs. Paul Miller, the head of the house, had been working at a local auto manufacturing plant for nearly 2 decades. Known for his dedication and a can-do attitude, Paul believed in providing the best possible life for his family. His job wasn't glamorous, but thanks to his strong work ethic and overtime hours, he earned enough to ensure his family never went without. On Friday evenings, his old pickup truck, a Ford he'd proudly assembled himself at the factory, pulled into the driveway right on time. That was the time the Miller family eagerly awaited. Linda Miller, Paul's wife and partner, was beloved in the local elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. Her warm smiles and sweet voice made her a favorite among children. At home, Linda was the glue that held the family together. She loved baking on weekends and had a particular knack for apple pies, which often won first prize at the church bake-offs every fall. Linda's devotion to her husband and children was evident in everything she did, from hand-stitched Halloween costumes for Emily and Ethan when they were little, to the handwritten notes she'd sneak into Paul's lunchbox. The Millers' days were filled with a comforting routine. Family dinners were sacred. Every weekday at 6:30 p.m., the 4 of them sat down at the oak dining table, a table Paul had made himself during his brief woodworking foray. Linda served her classic home-cooked meals, and the family would dive into conversations about their day. Emily often excitedly shared stories about her latest debate team wins and future college plans, while Ethan contributed just enough to avoid suspicion of his growing disinterest in school. Paul always asked, "So what did y'all learn today?" though his eyes inevitably lingered on Ethan, as if he were searching for clues to the boy's growing silence. The Millers' weekends were equally wholesome. Saturday mornings began with pancakes and bacon on the griddle, the kitchen filled with the sound of clattering pans and Linda's humming as she cooked. Sometimes they'd all pile into Paul's truck to visit the Detroit Zoo or take a stroll by Lake Michigan in the summer. Winters were spent indoors, layered under warm blankets with games of Monopoly stretched out on the coffee table in the living room. Their home, a cozy white colonial with green shutters, stood as the family's pride. Paul had painted the house himself one spring while Linda planted marigolds in the front yard. Inside it was a snapshot of American life. Framed family photos lined the mantel, and a Yankees game was always on in the background. Though they didn't live extravagantly, they'd splurged on an old popcorn machine, which became the family's bonding centerpiece during weekly movie nights. On those special nights, it wasn't uncommon to find the Millers all crammed onto the couch, each clutching a bowl of buttered popcorn, with Linda often dozing off midway through the film, much to everyone's amusement. The Miller children, Ethan and Emily, had grown up close, at least during their younger years. As kids, they'd spend hours outside building treehouses in the backyard or racing their bikes down the suburban streets. But in recent years, Ethan had started pulling away. He'd become quieter, angrier, and distant. A contrast to Emily, who was a bright and ambitious teen with scholarships already lined up for college. Despite these subtle cracks in the family portrait, the Millers had every reason to believe they had built a stable foundation. Paul often dreamed aloud of retiring early, taking Linda on a cross-country road trip in their RV. Linda had started collecting travel brochures for destinations like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone National Park. The failing son, Ethan Miller, the once bright-eyed boy who used to race his bike down Michigan's tree-lined streets and build forts from scrap wood, was now a shadow of the promise he once held. Standing at 22, he was restless and angry, grappling with a life that had not turned out how he had imagined. Ethan carried the weight of disappointment, not just his own but his parents as well. After finishing high school, Ethan swore he needed time to find himself. College to him was just another trap, a conveyor belt shoving kids into a lifestyle Ethan felt he'd never fit into. He whispered dreams of starting his own business or traveling the States, but as the months turned to years, those ambitions slowly dissolved into nothing but excuses. Ethan had tried a long list of odd jobs. Stocking shelves at a local hardware store lasted about a month. Ethan hated being told what to do. A gig as a barista ended in frustration when customers were too demanding and the paychecks too small. After quitting yet another job, he'd often retreat to the basement claiming he was planning his next move while playing online games or scrolling social media. To Linda and Paul, this was heartbreaking. Paul, who had worked tirelessly in the auto plant since he was Ethan's age, couldn't fathom why his son didn't show the same grit. Linda, ever the optimist, still believed Ethan just needed the right motivation. But Ethan didn't make it easy. His attitude began to morph in ways that worried them both. He was no longer the goofy, warm boy who'd run to the mailbox every day to see if the latest issue of Sports Illustrated had arrived. Now, he carried himself with a hardened air, his once animated laugh replaced by grunts and curt replies. He'd often come home hours after dinner, smelling like beer and burnt cigarettes, muttering replies to his parents' questions like, "I've got plans, don't worry about it," or, "It's no big deal, okay?" The arguments came swiftly and often. "You can't just sit around all day, Ethan," Paul yelled one evening after coming home to find Ethan sprawled on the couch, surrounded by empty soda cans and week-old takeout containers. "Do you know how hard I work to keep this roof over our heads? The least you can do is contribute." "Contribute? Seriously, Dad?" Ethan shot back, rising from the couch with defiance. His 6-foot-tall frame towered over Paul, but his father's gaze remained steady, unbothered. "You think I don't want a job? Maybe things aren't as easy as they were in your day." "Easy?" Paul's voice raised. "Let me tell you what's easy, giving up. That's what you're doing. You've given up on everything. I didn't raise a quitter, Ethan." Linda often stepped in, trying to diffuse the escalating tempers. "Paul, just calm down," she would plead, turning to Ethan. "Sweetheart, we just want to help. What's the plan? What are you going to do next?" But Ethan never answered. Instead, he'd storm out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed family photos in the hallway. Emily, meanwhile, looked at her brother with a mixture of pity and resentment. Growing up, she'd admired Ethan. He was the adventurous one, unafraid to climb the tallest trees or speak his mind in any situation. But now, he was someone she barely recognized. In their younger years, he would cheer her on at her Little League games and give her goofy nicknames like Squirt or Smarty Pants. But now their conversations rarely went beyond, "Move, you're blocking the TV," or "Do you have $20 I can borrow?" The truth was, Ethan wasn't just wrestling with his future. He was battling demons his family didn't fully understand. The pressure to live up to the Miller name to fit in, and to carve out a successful path all felt insurmountable. And instead of confronting this, Ethan buried his insecurities under layers of deflection, frustration, and the temporary comfort of late-night drinking with friends who expected nothing from him. Occasionally Ethan would talk about starting over. His best idea, a custom auto parts shop, seemed promising enough that Paul decided to fund it, despite Linda's objections. "He just needs something to believe in," Paul told her. They drained a significant chunk of their savings to secure a small rundown space for Ethan to launch his venture. Deep down, Paul hoped this would spark the fire his son seemed to have lost. But the shop only lasted 6 months before crashing spectacularly. Ethan, inexperienced with balancing budgets or managing inventory, ran the business into the ground. Bills piled up, customers dwindled, and Ethan's enthusiasm dissolved into sheer avoidance. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Paul demanded after the shop's closure. "Help? Like you'd understand what it's like running a business," Ethan snapped. "Don't turn this around on me, son," Paul shot back, his weariness unmistakable. "You know how much that investment cost us. Your mom and I busted our butts to help you, and this is what we get in return." The failure of the shop only deepened the fractures in the Miller household. Paul began picking up extra shifts to make up for the financial loss, while Linda buried her disappointment in long walks and church bake sales. Meanwhile, Ethan doubled down on his spiral of recklessness. Debt collectors started calling, and Linda began noticing her jewelry going missing, an act Ethan vigorously denied. Ethan's failures weren't just about missed opportunities or wasted money, they symbolized the growing distance between him and the rest of the family. He felt abandoned by their expectations, and they felt betrayed by his lack of effort. Still, there were fleeting glimpses of the old Ethan, the boy who'd dribble a basketball in the driveway for hours or spend whole Sundays perfecting his model car collection. Late at night, Linda would sometimes hear the sound of Ethan's guitar drifting softly through the house and would pray that, eventually, he'd find his way. The talented but burdened daughter, Emily Miller, bright and driven, had always been the pride of her family. At 18, she was the picture of potential, top of her class, captain of the debate team, and already holding acceptance letters to several prestigious universities. Her parents, Paul and Linda, were especially proud of her accomplishments, often bragging about her to neighbors while carefully saving up for her college fund. Despite the glowing exterior, Emily felt the heavy weight of expectation pressing down on her. Her success wasn't just her own, it was a banner her family clung to amidst struggles with her older brother Ethan's failures. It was as if the family's hopes for a brighter future had slowly transferred entirely onto her shoulders as Ethan spiraled further away. At school, Emily was unstoppable. Teachers adored her for her work ethic and leadership, especially Mrs. Warren, her debate coach. "Emily, you're a natural," Mrs. Warren would say after practice. "You have the voice, the presence, and the mind to go far. I see you at Yale in a few years." Hearing that used to fill Emily with pride. Now it only made her stomach twist. Her success became a double-edged sword at home. "You're our star," her father would often say at the dinner table, ruffling her hair. "Emily's gonna be running this country one day while Ethan's still figuring himself out," he'd joke, only half serious. Ethan would grunt, roll his eyes, and leave in the middle of dinner. Emily hated the way her achievements only seemed to underscore her brother's shortcomings. She could feel the growing resentment in his curt words, his refusal to really acknowledge her. "Oh look, it's Miss Perfect again," Ethan had muttered one Christmas as their parents gushed over her scholarship offers. But it wasn't just Ethan. Even her parents had started leaning on her more with each passing year. Linda, exhausted from trying to hold the family together, sometimes looked at Emily as though she weren't just her daughter but a co-parent. "Emily, can you keep an eye on Ethan?" she'd ask after another argument between Paul and Ethan failed to reach any resolution. "No, Mom," Emily would reply, exasperated. "I'm not his babysitter." "You know he listens to you more than he listens to us," Linda would plead. "He doesn't listen to anyone," Emily shot back. But no matter how resistant she acted, she'd dutifully knock on Ethan's door later that night, softening her tone. "Hey," she'd say cautiously, peeking her head into his dark, messy room. "Are you okay?" "Let me guess, Mom sent you," Ethan would mumble without looking up from his phone. "No, I came because... I don't know, I'm worried about you, okay?" "Whatever, Em, go back to saving the world or whatever it is perfect people do." Conversations with Ethan never went anywhere. No matter how hard Emily tried, she couldn't bridge the widening gap between them. And yet, when she returned to her room, shutting the door behind her, she felt the guilt weighing her down. She hated herself for always feeling angry at him. She hated him for making her feel so responsible. For Emily, the pressure wasn't just academic, it was emotional, familial, and deeply conflicting. On the surface, she had it together. Straight A's, a bright smile, and a growing list of accomplishments. But under that polished veneer, she was battling anxiety and the gnawing feeling that she'd eventually crack under the strain. Late at night, Emily would sit at her desk, studying or reviewing her college application essays. Usually these moments were her refuge, her escape from the chaos downstairs. But some nights the chaos wasn't so easily escaped. "You're not gonna make it anywhere if you keep screwing up," she could hear her dad yelling at Ethan from the living room while she tried to focus on her work. "I didn't ask to be born into this family," Ethan would snap back. The shouting matches had grown more frequent in recent months, and no matter how many times Emily put in her earbuds, she couldn't drown them out. Each argument felt like another crack forming in their once stable foundation, and Emily worried it was only a matter of time before the whole house came crashing down. Her friends at school rarely saw this side of her. "Emily, you're so lucky," Rachel, a fellow debater, would often say. "You've got the grades, you've got the looks, and your parents adore you. What's it like to have everything?" Emily would smile weakly, nodding to keep up appearances. They didn't know about the strain of trying to hold things together at home, the way it felt like she was constantly teetering on a thin line, trying not to fall. Sometimes the pressure boiled over. One evening, after another failed attempt to defuse a fight between Ethan and their father, Emily stormed to her room and slammed the door shut. Gripping the edge of her desk, she buried her head in her hands, the silent tears falling fast. "Why is this my job?" she thought furiously. "Why can't they just fix themselves?" The worst part wasn't even the pressure, it was the guilt. Guilt that she couldn't be all things to everyone. Guilt that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to reach Ethan. On some weekends when the house became too suffocating, Emily would pack her backpack and ride her bike to the local library. There, she'd sink into a corner with her debate prep or college essays, losing herself in the world of words and arguments. But even there, her mind wandered. What happens to this family when I leave for college? What happens to Ethan? What happens to Mom and Dad? Emily wanted to chase her dreams, to someday argue cases in front of the Supreme Court, or help write legislation that changed lives. But the thought of leaving home felt like a betrayal, like abandoning the ship while it was sinking. In her quieter moments, Emily dreamed of a life where she didn't feel like the glue holding everything together. A life where she wasn't the only successful one or the talented kid everyone counted on to fix things. She just wanted to be Emily. But for now, there were tests to ace, scholarships to win, and college interviews to prepare for. She had worked too hard to let the chaos at home derail her. Still, every time she sat down to plan her future, one question lingered in her mind. Would her family survive without her? The roots of conflict begin. The cracks in the Miller family didn't erupt overnight. Instead, they were laid brick by brick, built on years of disappointment, misunderstandings, and simmering frustration. But the tipping point came one summer night when Ethan approached his parents with what he called a golden opportunity. An idea that would supposedly change not just his life, but theirs too. "Mom, Dad, just hear me out," Ethan began, pacing the living room nervously as Paul set his coffee mug down on the table, and Linda folded her arms tightly. Ethan rarely had big ideas. The last time he declared a plan to get his life on track was 3 months prior, and it ended in him quitting another dead-end job. "All right, son, let's hear it," Paul said, exchanging a cautious glance with Linda, who gave a skeptical sigh but said nothing. "So, you know how I've always been into cars, right?" Ethan started, his voice carrying a spark of excitement that momentarily softened his usually hardened demeanor. "I've been researching this market. There's a real demand for custom auto parts. People are paying crazy money for personalized stuff, rims, paint jobs, dashboard upgrades, you name it. And I was thinking, what if I opened my own shop?" Paul's eyebrows shot up. "Your own shop?" "Yeah, I'd call it Ethan's Customs. I'd work on cars, do detailing, get the word out online. I've been watching YouTube tutorials, and there's this guy in Arizona doing something similar. He's making a killing. All I need is a little upfront capital to get started. I mean, you could think of it as an investment." Linda stiffened slightly. She had heard this tone before, the same nervous confidence Ethan always wielded when he was pitching something he hadn't fully thought through. "And just how much upfront capital are we talking about, Ethan?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. Ethan hesitated. $15,000, he said quickly, blurting it out before he could chicken out. $15,000? Linda exclaimed, her voice rising several octaves. "Ethan, that's more money than your dad and I have saved for the past 2 years combined. Are you out of your mind?" Paul, ever the peacekeeper, held up a hand to calm his wife. "Linda, let's not dismiss it outright." Turning to his son, he added, "Explain to me exactly how you'd make this work, Ethan. I need more than an idea. What's your plan?" Ethan faltered slightly under his father's gaze. "Well, I'd, rent a small space in town, probably somewhere off the main road. I'll update the garage with some tools and equipment. Then, once I start getting customers, I'll reinvest the profits, build it up from there." "And how are you going to get customers?" Linda pressed, her tone dripping with doubt. "I'll figure it out," Ethan retorted defensively. "Social media maybe, or word of mouth. Mike from my old job said he'd bring his car in if I opened something. People trust me when it comes to car stuff." Linda's frustration began to boil over. "Ethan, you failed to hold on to a warehouse job last month because you couldn't deal with mornings. You couldn't keep your barista gig because you didn't want to take orders from people. What exactly makes you think you're ready to run an entire business?" "That's enough, Linda," Paul interjected firmly. Ethan had flinched at his mother's words, but Paul's expression remained thoughtful. "It's not a terrible idea, actually. People do spend a fortune on custom work. He's got passion for cars, that much we know." Linda shot her husband a disbelieving look. "Passion doesn't pay the bills, Paul. This isn't about gambling on a dream. This is about the fact that if we hand over $15,000, it might as well be flushed down the drain." Ethan, who had been silently fuming, finally snapped. "You always do this, Mom. You never believe in me. Never! Why don't you trust that I can actually build something for myself? God forbid you give me a little support for once in my life." "Support?" Linda fired back, her face coloring with anger. "Look around, Ethan. You've had more support than most people could dream of. Your father works 50 hours a week just to keep this place running. We've bailed you out at least 6 times in the last year alone. Trust you? You haven't given us much of a reason to lately, have you?" The room went silent except for Ethan's labored breathing. The words stung more than he wanted to admit. Paul finally broke the tension. "Linda, let's take a step back." He turned to his son and said, "Ethan, here's the deal. I'll help you, but we're not giving you a handout. If you want this loan, you're going to draw up a real plan, a business model, projections, something in writing. You're going to act like this is a professional arrangement because it is." Linda crossed her arms tighter, her disapproval plain. "Paul, we should be using that money for Emily. What about her college fund? Why does everything have to go toward fixing Ethan's mistakes?" Paul sighed. "Emily's going to be fine, Linda. She's bright, she's driven, and we've still got time to plan. Ethan needs this shot right now, or he's going to keep drifting." Ethan, sensing he had finally won his father's support, nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I'll draft up a plan, Dad, I can do this, you'll see." But Linda wasn't sold. She stormed off to the kitchen, muttering, "Mark my words, this is going straight to hell." Her parting words hung heavy in the air as Paul and Ethan sat in uneasy silence. 3 months later, as Linda had predicted, the business collapsed. Ethan's mismanagement, his inability to track inventory, and his tendency to argue with customers sealed its fate. When they closed the doors to Ethan's Customs for good, thousands of dollars had been lost. Money Paul and Linda had worked tirelessly to save. The failure planted the seed for growing resentment in the family. Linda and Paul began arguing more fiercely than ever, with Linda repeatedly throwing Paul's decision back in his face. "You should have listened to me," she'd say bitterly. Meanwhile, Ethan avoided the topic altogether, retreating further into his world of excuses and avoidance. This one decision, though meant as an act of hope, became the spark that ignited a storm in the Miller family, one that nobody knew how to stop. The mother's growing resentment. Linda Miller was a woman known for her patience. She was the kind of mother who stayed up late sewing costumes for the school play, who packed love notes in her children's lunches, and who instinctively smoothed over arguments at the dinner table. But even the softest hearts have their limits. The years of Ethan's drifting, Paul's endless forgiveness, and her own sacrifices had worn Linda down. She felt increasingly like an outsider in her own family, a voice of reason no one listened to until it was too late, and even then, no one seemed to admit she'd been right. Things truly began to boil after the collapse of Ethan's business venture, a failure she had seen coming from the moment Ethan asked for $15,000 in family savings. But Paul, ever the dreamer when it came to his son, had ignored her warnings. "How could you not see this coming?" Linda asked, her voice sharp as she stood in the kitchen one evening, washing dishes with a ferocity that sent soap suds flying. Paul sat at the table behind her, exhausted after his second overtime shift that week. "I didn't know it would turn out this way, Linda," Paul replied wearily, rubbing his temples. His tone was conciliatory, but it did little to soothe Linda's simmering anger. "I thought giving him a chance might change things for him. You know how much he loves cars. I wanted to believe in him." Linda spun around, flinging a dish towel onto the counter. Believing in him, Paul? That's not what this was. This was throwing good money after bad. You didn't listen to me. You never listen to me when it comes to Ethan." Paul ran a hand through his hair. "You're acting like everything is black and white. He's our son, Linda. What was I supposed to do? Let him rot here with no direction, no goal, nothing to hold on to?" "Yes, Ethan is our son," Linda countered, her voice rising. "But so is Emily. Or have you forgotten about her while you're busy propping him up over and over again? Where is her $15,000 for college, huh? Where are her chances? Why does everything have to revolve around Ethan's endless screw-ups?" At the mention of Emily, Paul fell silent. Linda pressed on, shaking her head as tears of frustration welled up in her eyes. "This isn't just about money, Paul. It's about the fact that you keep protecting him, enabling him, while the rest of us have to pay the price. Do you know how hard I've worked to make sure this family held together while you've gone and given him chance after chance?" Paul stood up from the table, his voice calm but strained. "You think I don't care about Emily? About you? You think this hasn't been hard for me too? I'm breaking my back every day to make sure we all have what we need. I see Ethan struggling and God, Linda, what if it were you? Would you just give up on your own kid?" Linda visibly softened for a moment. Briefly it seemed like Paul's words might reach her, but then she stiffened again. "Giving up on him? Don't you dare twist this like I don't love my son. Of course I do, but loving someone doesn't mean coddling them until they ruin everything, Paul. It means holding them accountable." From the next room, Emily could hear every word. She sat at the dining table with her debate notes spread out in front of her, but her pen hadn't moved in minutes. Arguments between her parents about Ethan had become so familiar that she could practically predict their rhythms, the sharp accusations, the frustrated silences, the inevitable escalation. And then there was Ethan himself, oblivious as ever. While his mother and father wore themselves down fighting over him, Ethan was upstairs in his room, headphones blaring as he played a video game. Linda's resentment extended beyond Paul. It latched onto Ethan, clinging to every careless thing he did or said, the way he avoided work, the smirk he gave when he slouched down to dinner late and ignored the tension in the room, the excuses that tumbled from his mouth whenever he failed once again. One evening, after yet another call from a debt collector related to Ethan's failed business, Linda snapped. Ethan was sprawled on the couch in the living room, scrolling mindlessly on his phone while Linda stood above him, her face a mix of rage and despair. "Are you proud of yourself?" she asked, her hands trembling. Ethan looked up, confused. "What are you even talking about, Mom?" "This." She gestured wildly to the stack of bills on the coffee table. "This mess that you've dumped on us. Do you understand what you've done to this family? Do you even care?" Ethan rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go again. I'm sorry, okay? What more do you want me to say?" "I don't want your apologies, Ethan. I want you to grow up." Linda's voice broke, tears streaming down her face now. "I am so tired of cleaning up after you with my time, my energy, and my money. Do you even realize how much your father is working to make up for your failures? Do you even care about anyone but yourself?" Paul came in from the kitchen, placing a hand on Linda's shoulder. "Calm down, Linda, you're not helping." "I'm not helping?" Linda whirled to face him. "Paul, this is exactly the problem. I'm the only one trying to hold him accountable, and you keep letting him off the hook. You can't keep sweeping this under the rug and hoping it goes away. It's not going away." For once, Ethan didn't have a snarky reply. He stared at the floor in awkward silence as his mother's words hung in the air. Linda stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. For the first time it felt like years of bottled-up frustration had finally erupted, but instead of feeling relief, all she felt was exhaustion. When she looked in the mirror that evening, she barely recognized herself. Her once gentle face was drawn tight with worry lines, her eyes tired and swollen, and it hit her in that moment. She wasn't angry because she didn't care. She was angry because she had cared so much, for so long, and it felt like no one else in her family truly listened. Linda knew that the resentment brewing inside her was pulling her further away from Paul and Ethan, but she didn't know how to stop it, and the more she tried to hold it in, the heavier the weight became. Ethan pushes the family to the brink. Ethan's downward spiral didn't just affect him, it infected the entire household like a slow-moving poison. His refusal to take responsibility, his reckless decisions, and the growing tension with his parents had already cracked the fragile foundation of the Miller family. But the day he began gambling was the day those cracks turned into shattering fault lines. It started small, as it often does. Ethan had been hanging out with some guys he'd met at the local bar, most of whom shared his disillusioned, aimless outlook on life. They introduced him to sports betting. "It's nothing big," one of them said, grinning while nursing a beer. "Bet $30, make a quick 100, no harm, no foul." On paper, it seemed easy. Ethan wasn't working, his bank account was nearly empty, but the idea of quick money piqued his interest. Ethan began betting small amounts, never more than $50 at first. But gambling is rarely something that stays small, especially for someone like Ethan, who was desperate for a win. When he lost, the frustration gnawed at him. He'd double down on the next bet, convinced he'd make his money back. But each time the hole got deeper, and soon he found himself placing bets far beyond what he could afford. At first, Ethan kept it quiet, keeping his late nights in smoky poker rooms and shady clubs a secret. But as the debts piled up and the calls from unknown numbers became more frequent, it wasn't long before the truth began creeping into the Miller household. One rainy evening, Ethan barged into the living room where Paul was watching the Yankees game and Linda was folding laundry. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled, and there was a pale, sickly tension in his expression. "Dad, Mom, I need to talk to you." Linda stopped folding, resting the basket on her lap. There was something about Ethan's tone that chilled her. Paul muted the TV and turned his full attention to his son. "What's going on, Ethan?" Paul asked, his brow furrowing. Ethan paced back and forth, his hands gripping the back of his neck. "Okay, so, I'm in a little bit of trouble, but it's nothing I can't fix. I just need some help right now." Linda's heart sank. Trouble from Ethan almost always meant one thing. "What kind of trouble?" she pressed. Ethan paused, visibly struggling to spit it out. "There's this guy, well these guys, and I owe them money. For some bets I made." Paul narrowed his eyes. "Bets? Ethan, what kind of bets? Gambling? Tell me you're not talking about gambling." "Dad, calm down, it's not a big deal." "It is a big deal," Paul thundered, leaping to his feet. "Are you seriously standing here telling us you've been gambling? After everything? After we just cleaned up your last disaster?" Ethan raised his hands defensively. "Look, I didn't come here for a lecture. I just need some money to make it right, okay? Once I pay them, it's over. I'm done with this, I swear." "How much?" Linda asked quietly, though her tone carried a weight of barely contained dread. Ethan hesitated. $6,000. $6,000? Linda nearly dropped the basket from her lap. Her voice cracked under the shock of it. "Ethan, we don't have $6,000 to just hand over. Are you out of your mind?" Paul's face had turned a deep shade of red. "You lied to us. You went behind our backs, wasted God knows how much money, and now you're coming here with some gambling debts expecting us to bail you out? I didn't waste it, Look, you don't understand," Ethan shot back, his voice trembling now with both frustration and desperation. "These guys aren't playing around. If I don't pay them, things are gonna get bad." "Bad?" Linda's voice rose. "What does that even mean, Ethan? Are you being threatened?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. He glanced at the ground, his jaw tightening, and muttered, "They've already sent someone to my place, smashed my car window." Paul pressed a hand to his temple as though trying to force away reality. "This is unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. You've gotten yourself involved with criminals, Ethan, and now you want us to fix it? Just loan me the money, I'll pay it back, I swear," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking in desperation. Linda stood up, trembling not with fear, but with anger that had been pressed down for too long. Her voice was sharp, stinging like ice. "No, Ethan, we're done. We've bailed you out more times than I can count, and what do we have to show for it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You've burned through our trust, through our savings, and now you're standing here asking for more." "I'll pay it back!" Ethan shouted, his face red with frustration. "No, you won't!" Linda snapped. Her voice cut the room like a blade. "You won't because you never do. This is who you are, Ethan. You make a mess and expect everyone else to clean it up. Not this time." Ethan clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. "You don't understand. If I don't pay, they're gonna come after me. After us. You think I want to be in this situation? You think I want this life?" Linda took one step closer to him, her voice quieter but no less venomous. "You don't want this life? Then why do you keep choosing it? Why do you make mistake after mistake after mistake?" Paul, who had been silent for a painful moment, finally spoke. "Ethan, you need to leave. Go cool off. Figure out how to make this right, but we're not giving you $6,000 to bail you out of a hole you dug yourself." Ethan stared at his father, his face a twisted mix of betrayal and fury. "You're gonna regret this," he muttered before storming out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him so hard the walls seemed to tremble. Paul put his head in his hands while Linda stood frozen, her chest tight with years of pent-up frustration and heartbreak. She didn't say it, but deep inside she couldn't help but wonder, when would their son's mistake stop being their responsibility? Outside, Ethan climbed into his car, his mind spinning with rage and panic. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to solve this nightmare, and with every passing second, that pressure built, threatening to explode. And it wouldn't be long before it did, with devastating consequences. The final explosion. It was a hot, humid July night when everything in the Miller family unraveled. Ethan had already pushed his parents to their limits, but tonight would mark the moment when years of pressure, anger, and exhaustion bubbled over into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Ethan stumbled into the house around 11:30 p.m., the sound of the door slamming jolting Linda awake. She was on the couch in the living room, a place she'd spent more nights recently because Paul's snoring had become unbearable and because she didn't have the emotional energy to fight with him about Ethan. The moment Ethan walked in, Linda could tell something was off. He reeked of alcohol, his shirt was untucked, and his movements were clumsy and erratic. But it wasn't just his physical state, it was the wild, dangerous look in his eyes, one she'd never seen on her son before. "Ethan," Linda said sharply, sitting up straight as he staggered into the room, "do you have any idea what time it is? And look at you, you're drunk, aren't you?" Ethan waved her off, his steps uneven as he tripped over the coffee table and landed heavily in the recliner. "Oh, for God's sake, Mom, not now, I don't want to hear it." "That's not how this works," Linda snapped, standing with her arms crossed. Her frustration had reached a boiling point after weeks of tension. She had stayed silent long enough, biting her tongue every time Ethan made another excuse or dodged responsibility. But tonight, something inside her broke. "Do you think this is okay, Ethan? Walking in here drunk after all the things you've put us through? After all the lies, all the messes? You have some nerve!" Ethan rubbed his temples, clearly uninterested in what she was saying. "Jesus, can't you just let it go for once? You're always on my back. Always!" Linda took a step closer, her voice raising. "Of course I'm on your back. Do you know what you've done to this family? To me? Your father works himself into the ground to pay for your mistakes. I can't remember the last time I actually slept through the night, and Emily doesn't even come home anymore because she can't stand the stress. And you," her voice cracked, "you just keep taking and taking and taking." Ethan stood up suddenly, swaying slightly but towering over her. The movement startled Linda, but she didn't step back. She wouldn't let him intimidate her. "Do you think I ask for this life?" Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the room. His face was flushed red, either from alcohol or anger, or both. "Do you think I want to mess everything up? Do you think I like being the screw-up you always talk about behind my back?" Linda shot back without hesitation, her voice venomous. "Maybe if you tried, even a little, you wouldn't be the screw-up we're so sick of cleaning up after. Instead you drink, you gamble, and you waste every chance we give you. I'm done, Ethan. I'm done with you dragging all of us down with you." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his breathing labored. "You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it feels like to be me. To be the guy who can't do anything right, no matter how hard he tries. You think it's easy, huh? Being the failure?" "I think you've been using that excuse for years," Linda screamed, the tension in her voice now breaking into rage. "Every time you mess up, it's someone else's fault. It's the world, or your father, or me. But it's you, Ethan, it's you." The words struck Ethan like a slap. He froze for a moment, processing the bitterness in his mother's voice. His eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. "If you hate me so much," he said in a low, dangerous voice, "why don't you just kick me out? Why don't you just throw me away like the garbage I am?" Linda's voice softened for the first time. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the broken, angry young man she didn't recognize anymore. "Because you're my son, Ethan," she said after a long pause. "But I don't even know who you are anymore." "Yeah?" Ethan took a step closer, closing the gap between them. "Well, here's the thing, Mom. I don't know who you are either. All I see is someone who blames me for their own miserable life." At that, Linda's face hardened, her hands shaking. "Get out of my sight, Ethan. Just go to your room before this gets worse." "You're not going to tell me what to do!" Ethan exploded, his voice booming as his frustration boiled over. He grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the coffee table that he'd brought in with him and threw it at the wall. The glass shattered, the golden liquid dripping onto the floor. Linda flinched, her body tense with fear. "Ethan, enough! That's it! Get out of this house! Out!" "Or what?" Ethan sneered, taking a step closer. "You gonna call the cops on me, huh? Or maybe you'll pack all my stuff and dump me on the curb. Do it, I dare you!" Paul, who had been asleep in the bedroom, suddenly appeared in the doorway, his face exhausted and confused. "What the hell is going on in here?" he barked, stepping into the living room. Linda pointed at Ethan. "Your son, your perfect little son, is drunk and out of control, again." "Mom said she's done with me," Ethan slurred, turning to face his father. "Well, guess what? I'm done too. Done with all of this. You think I ruined this family? Fine, maybe I did. Maybe it'd be better if I wasn't here at all." "Ethan, that's enough," Paul said firmly, stepping between him and Linda. But there was something primal and unrelenting in Ethan's expression now, a darkness that neither Paul nor Linda had seen before. And then it happened. In the heat of the moment, Ethan turned toward his mother, still holding the neck of the shattered whiskey bottle. His vision blurred, his mind clouded with alcohol and rage. He raised the bottle instinctively, and before anyone could stop him, he brought it down. The impact was sudden and brutal. Linda's scream was cut short as she hit the floor, a deep gash on her temple spilling bright red blood onto the beige carpet. "Mom!" Paul shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. "What the hell have you done, Ethan? What have you done?" The realization hit Ethan like a freight train as he stared down at his mother's unconscious body. The bottle slipped from his hand, shattering further on the floor. He stumbled back, his hands shaking as the weight of what he'd done began to sink in. I didn't mean to," Ethan stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." Paul's face twisted in a mix of rage and heartbreak as he turned to his son. Get out of this house before I do something I'll regret." Ethan bolted, staggering out the door and into the dark night. Inside, Paul frantically called 911, his hands covered in his wife's blood as he tried to stem the bleeding. The Miller family had long been teetering on the edge of disaster, but tonight, that final explosion shattered everything in its path. The crime buried in secrecy. Ethan froze, his chest heaving as he looked down at his mother's lifeless body sprawled out on the living room floor. Blood seeped into the beige carpet, a stark contrast to the warm interior of the home Linda had worked so hard to maintain. Paul knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he pressed a towel to her wound, but it was too late. Linda was gone. The weight of what had just happened crashed over Ethan like a tidal wave. His breathing became erratic and his hands shook violently. "Dad, I didn't mean to do it," he stammered. Tears ran down his face as panic gripped him. "I didn't mean it, it was an accident." Paul looked up at his son, his face a mixture of rage, sorrow, and disbelief. "Ethan," he choked out, his voice raw with anguish. What have you done? What have you done? I just lost control, Ethan pleaded, taking a shaky step back. It was the bottle, I wasn't thinking. You've got to believe me, Dad. Paul pressed his hand against his forehead, trying to calm the storm raging in his mind. He wanted to scream, to yell at Ethan, to shake him until he realized what he'd done. But there was no time for that now. Linda was dead. Nothing he said or did could reverse that. She's gone, Paul whispered, more to himself than to Ethan. His voice cracked under the weight of those two words. Your mother. She's gone. Ethan sank to his knees, gripping his head with both hands. What are we going to do, Dad? What are we supposed to do now? I can't go to prison. This was a mistake. She tripped, or I slipped. Something. I swear it wasn't on purpose. Paul stood slowly, feeling years of exhaustion and grief weigh down every movement. He stared down at Linda's body, then at his son. For what felt like an eternity, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan and Ethan's sharp, uneven breaths. You're right, Paul finally said, his voice steady in a way that almost scared him. You can't go to prison. We can't let this destroy everything. What are you saying? Ethan asked, his voice trembling as he looked at his father. Paul closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. I'm saying we don't call the police. Not yet. Ethan's eyes widened. What? Dad, are you serious? What are we supposed to do? Just leave her here? No, Paul snapped, his voice laced with an authority that silenced any more questions from Ethan. No, we're not leaving her here. We'll take care of it. We'll figure this out. But you're not going to jail. Do you hear me? Ethan nodded, though his hands were still trembling. Okay. What do we do, Dad? Tell me. I'll do whatever you say. Paul knelt back down beside Linda and pulled the blood-soaked towel from her head. His hands shook as he gently covered her face with it. Listen to me carefully, Ethan, he said without looking at him. We move her to the garage, tonight. No one else can know. Ethan blinked, his face pale and drawn. What if someone finds out? That's not going to happen, Paul said firmly, though his voice betrayed the fear simmering beneath his calm exterior. We'll make sure of it. Later that night, the sound of a shovel scraping against concrete echoed through the garage as Paul pulled out the large tarp he used for covering furniture when he painted. The Miller family's modest home had a small detached garage filled with boxes, tools, and an old exercise bike. A space that had once felt safe and normal now felt suffocating. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the tarp as if it were some otherworldly object. I don't think I can do this, Dad, he whispered. This is Mom. Paul turned to him, his face hard and unyielding. You think this is easy for me? He snapped, his voice like a whip in the night air. That's your mother in there, my wife, but if we don't handle this, if we don't get it together, you'll be in a prison cell for the rest of your life. Do you want that? Ethan shook his head quickly. No, I don't. I don't know if I can even move her. I don't know if I can touch her like that. Paul grabbed Ethan by the shoulders and looked into his son's tear-filled eyes. You don't have a choice, Paul said firmly, though his voice cracked slightly under the weight of his emotions. Neither of us does. Together, they carried Linda's lifeless body, wrapped in a blanket, out to the garage. The walk from the house to the garage felt endless, and every small sound, a distant dog barking, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, made Ethan flinch. Once they were in the dim, cluttered garage, Paul spread the tarp on the floor. Lay her down gently, he said gruffly, as if giving himself instructions just as much as Ethan. They lowered Linda onto the tarp and Paul stepped back, staring down at her. She looked so peaceful now, as though she'd simply fallen asleep. Paul's eyes welled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, not wanting Ethan to see him falter. Ethan, meanwhile, leaned against the wall, shaking violently, his breath coming in short gasps. It's not right. This isn't right, Dad. We should have called someone. The police. An ambulance. Something. Paul rounded on him, his expression fierce. You think they'd believe us? You think they'd listen to, it was an accident? Or, I didn't mean to? This isn't about what's right anymore, Ethan. It's about survival. Do you understand? Ethan nodded quickly, tears streaming down his face. I get it. Paul drew in a deep, shuddering breath, wiping his face as he looked around the garage. His gaze landed on his old workbench where a half-empty can of paint sat next to some tools. We lock up the garage, he decided. Nobody goes in here. What about the smell? Ethan asked quietly, his voice trembling. I'll take care of it, Paul replied, though how he'd take care of it he didn't yet know. For now, we don't say anything to anyone. Not the neighbors, not Emily, no one. At the mention of Emily, Ethan looked up sharply, guilt and shame written all over his face. What are we going to tell her? Mom's just gone? Paul turned away, unable to look his son in the eyes. "We'll deal with that when we have to," he said. "For now, we bury it, we bury everything." Father and son stood in the oppressive silence of the garage, surrounded by shadows and the weight of their shared crime. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them knew how they would ever find a way forward. But deep down, Paul couldn't ignore the growing feeling in his gut that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The daughter discovers the truth. Emily hadn't wanted to come home that weekend. It wasn't exactly a secret that things at the Miller household were tense. Her parents argued constantly about Ethan, and Ethan had become someone she barely recognized. But when her father called and told her in his calm, practiced tone that her mother had gone to visit a friend and might not be back for a while, something in her gut didn't feel right. "Which friend?" Emily had asked on the phone, standing in the quaint dorm room she shared with her roommate. "A church friend," Paul had replied vaguely, his voice distant, hollow. "You know how your mom likes her retreats." It didn't sit well with her. Her mom wasn't impulsive. She didn't just leave without giving Emily some idea of her plans. A text message, a voicemail, something. But there was nothing but a cold, confusing silence. 2 days later, Emily packed her weekend bag and drove the 3 hours home, a growing unease gripping her chest as the suburban streets she grew up on came into view. The house feels different. The minute Emily stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The house felt off. Sure, it was clean, like her dad had rushed to tidy up before she arrived, but it was too clean. The air was heavy, like it was thick with unspoken words. And then there was Ethan. Ethan was sitting on the living room couch, slouched like a sack of laundry. He looked thinner, his face pale and sullen, his eyes avoiding hers as she walked in. Her father, standing in the kitchen, shot Ethan a warning glance Emily wasn't supposed to notice. "Hey, Em," Ethan muttered, his voice low, tired. "Hey," Emily replied, but didn't approach him. Something about his demeanor sent a chill through her. "Where's Mom?" Her father was the one who answered. "She's out of town, sweetheart, just a little break. She needed it." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Out of town? Dad, Mom doesn't just take breaks, she would have told me. Where exactly did she go?" Paul faltered, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter with one hand. "Why don't you go unload your bags first? We'll talk later." That was Paul's way, deflect and delay. But Emily wasn't having it. "I don't want to unpack. I want to know where Mom is." She turned toward Ethan, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know anything? You're acting weird." Ethan stiffened, his hand twitching like he wanted to reach for something, anything, to absolve him of the weight of her question. "Why would I know?" he snapped defensively, though his voice trembled. "She's probably just doing her own thing. Since when does everything need an explanation?" Emily's stomach tightened. "Since always, Ethan," she snapped back, stepping closer to him. "Because that's how she is. She doesn't just disappear. God, you're acting shady. What are you not telling me?" "Emily, that's enough," Paul interjected sharply, his voice startlingly firm. "Your mother's fine. She'll be back soon. Now drop it." But Emily didn't drop it. She spent the evening watching them both. Ethan barely made eye contact with her, retreating to his room almost as soon as dinner was over. Meanwhile, her father tried too hard to seem normal, forcing smiles that didn't reach his eyes, and avoiding any hint of conversation about Linda's trip. The clue in the garage. The next morning Emily woke early. Although the house was quiet, her mind wasn't. She stood by the kitchen window sipping her coffee, her eyes wandering to the garage. Something about it felt wrong. The old paint cans that her dad used for projects were always neatly stored, but yesterday, when she parked the car, she'd noticed them stacked oddly, almost as if hiding something. Her heart raced as she moved quietly toward the garage. The door creaked open, and the musty air hit her like a wave. The first thing she noticed was how tightly sealed the windows were. Black trash bags had been taped over the panes, letting in almost no light. Her dad had never done anything like that before. Frowning, Emily stepped inside, her hand brushing against her phone in her pocket. She reached for the pull string to turn on the overhead light, her pulse rising with every breath. At first everything looked normal. Boxes of Christmas decorations, an old exercise bike, the same tools that hadn't moved in years. But the smell was what got her. It wasn't strong, but it was unmistakable. The faint metallic tang of something wrong, something dead. Emily's breath hitched as she took another step forward, her eyes scanning the floor. That's when she saw it, the tarp. It was tucked into the corner under some wooden planks, but one edge jutted out, almost as if daring her to come closer. Biting her lip, she knelt down. her heart slamming against her ribs as her fingers brushed the edge of the worn blue plastic. "Emily!" Her father's voice roared from the doorway, jolting her so hard she almost fell backward. Paul was standing there, his face pale, his voice frantic. "What are you doing in here? What's under this tarp?" she shot back, her voice firm despite the lump rising in her throat. "You need to leave the garage now," Paul ordered, stepping toward her. "What are you hiding?" Emily demanded, refusing to back down. "Dad, I swear to God, if something's happened to Mom—" "She's fine!" Paul bellowed, but the crack in his voice gave him away. "Leave it alone, Emily!" "No!" she shouted, standing her ground. "Not until you tell me what's going on!" Her eyes darted toward the tarp and back to her father. Is Mom under there?" Paul froze, his fists clenching for a moment before he relaxed them, his shoulders sinking as though the weight of the world had finally crushed him. His expression softened, his forced control slipping away. "Emily," he began, his tone low and pained. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." A cold chill raced down her spine. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What did you do?" "It was an accident," her father said, his voice trembling. "It was Ethan. He didn't mean to. He just lost control and—" Paul's voice broke as he gestured helplessly toward the tarp. "We didn't know what to do. We thought we could protect him." "Protect him?" Emily's voice rose, her hands shaking. "You thought hiding Mom like some piece of trash was protecting him? Are you both insane?" "It wasn't like that," Paul insisted, his desperation showing now. "I couldn't lose him too, Emily. I couldn't—" "You already lost me!" she screamed, her eyes welling up with tears. "The second you decided to cover up what he did, you lost me." Paul stepped closer to her, pleading. "Emily, please, you have to understand." But Emily didn't wait to hear what came next. She turned and stormed past him, running to her car with her hands fumbling for her phone. She didn't care about loyalty or family anymore. What mattered now was the truth, and she was going to make sure everyone knew it. An unthinkable betrayal. Ethan had been spiraling for weeks, barely holding himself together in the aftermath of the crime. While Paul kept a tight lid on the situation, insisting they act normal and say nothing, Ethan's resolve crumbled day by day. Unbearable guilt gnawed at his consciousness, and the weight of their secret seemed to drag him deeper into his own hopelessness. One Saturday night, after nearly emptying an entire bottle of whiskey, Ethan found himself in the company of his old high school buddy, Kyle. Kyle was Ethan's go-to drinking partner, someone who rarely judged and always offered an escape into the haze of alcohol and mindless banter. The two of them were sitting in Kyle's dimly lit basement, half watching a football game as they passed a cheap bottle of liquor back and forth. Ethan was slouched on the worn-out couch, his eyes bloodshot, his words slurred but filled with a heavy tension. "Man, you ever do something so bad," Ethan mumbled, staring at the flickering TV screen, "that you don't even know if you're still a good person?" Kyle laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, Ethan, everyone's done dumb shit. What did you do? Steal a candy bar? Crash a car?" Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling as he took another sip. He muttered, more to himself than to Kyle, "It's bigger than that, man. Way bigger. It's bad." Kyle leaned forward, his curiosity piqued by Ethan's unusually morose tone. "What are you talking about?" Ethan looked up at Kyle, his eyes rimmed with desperation. I don't even know why I'm telling you this, dude, but my mom. Something happened to my mom. He hesitated, feeling the cold sweat on the back of his neck. "I was drunk and angry and we were fighting and now my mom's—" He cut himself off, his voice breaking. Kyle froze, the playful smirk on his face replaced by a look of confusion and alarm. Wait, what? What happened to your mom?" Ethan clenched his jaw, avoiding Kyle's pressing gaze. His voice dropped to a whisper. "She's gone, man. She's just gone. And my dad, he covered it up. For me. We hid it. The garage, she's still there." The air in the room turned unbearably heavy, the sound of the football game on TV fading into the background as Kyle stared at Ethan in stunned silence. "You mean like, gone? What the hell are you saying, Ethan?" Tears began to well up in Ethan's eyes. He buried his face in his hands, muttering, "I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident, okay? It just happened, and now everything is a mess." For a moment Kyle didn't say anything, his mind racing to piece together everything Ethan was confessing. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. Finally he stood up, pacing the small space of the basement. "Ethan, do you have any idea what you've just told me? This is crazy! You can't just dump something like that on me!" "I know!" Ethan shouted, his raw voice echoing off the walls. "I know I screwed up, but I can't keep it in anymore, man. It's eating me alive." Kyle ran a hand through his hair, panic creeping into his own tone now. You're talking about your mom, Ethan, about a freaking crime. This is serious. I mean, Jesus, this is murder. No, Ethan snapped back. It wasn't murder. It wasn't like that. I didn't mean to, I swear. Do you hear yourself right now? Kyle stopped pacing and pointed a finger at Ethan. You've got to fix this. I don't know how, but you can't just sit on something like this. The cops. No cops, Ethan growled, his eyes wild. If they find out, I'll go to prison forever. My dad said we couldn't tell anyone. That's why we kept it quiet. Kyle stared at him, his face pale. And what? You thought telling me was gonna make it any better? What do you expect me to do now, Ethan, huh? Just forget what I heard? Ethan grabbed Kyle by the shoulders, his grip frantic. You can't say anything, Kyle, please. I need you to keep your mouth shut. I trusted you, man. Kyle's lips pressed into a thin line as he wrestled with his own guilt and fear. Without another word, he shook Ethan off and stormed up the stairs, leaving Ethan alone in the basement. The betrayal. 2 days later, the knock came at the Miller family's door. It was sharp and authoritative, sending a chill down Paul's spine as he sat at the kitchen table. He exchanged a look with Ethan, who was slouched in a chair, his face pale and drawn. Paul opened the door to find 2 police officers standing on the porch. One, a tall man with a stern expression, held up a badge. Are you Paul Miller? Yes, Paul replied cautiously, gripping the edge of the door. What's this about? We received a tip about a serious matter involving your family. We'd like to ask you and your son a few questions. Ethan's heart dropped as he stumbled to his feet. He felt every ounce of liquor he'd consumed in the past 48 hours rush to his head. Dad! He croaked, his voice barely audible. Paul turned sharply, his face twisting with a mix of anger and panic. Ethan, what did you do? I didn't, Ethan stammered, but his voice cracked under the pressure. He could already feel the walls closing in. He knew who tipped the police off. Kyle. The betrayal burned in his chest hotter than any drink ever had, but deep down he couldn't blame him. After all, hadn't Kyle done the one thing Ethan was too cowardly to do? Hadn't Kyle done what was right? The officers stepped inside, their expressions cold and professional. We're going to need you both to come with us, the taller officer said. We have some questions about Linda Miller's disappearance. Paul tried to keep his composure, but his hands shook as he turned to Ethan. This is your fault, he hissed under his breath. I told you to keep your mouth shut. Ethan looked at his father with haunted eyes, but he didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. The secret was out, and their carefully constructed lie had begun to crumble beneath. Justice under the law. The courtroom was packed the day Ethan and Paul Miller took the stand. The gallery buzzed with hushed murmurs, a mix of neighbors, friends, and those drawn by the sensational nature of the trial. The horrific details surrounding Linda Miller's death had rocked the small suburban community to its core. People whispered about betrayal, tragedy, and the blurred lines between love and morality. Ethan sat beside his attorney, his face gaunt and pale, a stark reminder of sleepless nights and the months of guilt that had driven him to the edge. Paul was right next to him, stoic, yet visibly weighed down by the crushing reality of their situation. The trial begins. All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Prescott. The bailiff's authoritative voice echoed across the courtroom. A sharp shuffle of feet followed as everyone stood. The judge, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes, gazed out at the room as she took her seat. Be seated, she instructed, her voice steady and stern. The prosecution wasted no time framing its case. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Klein stood up, adjusting her blazer as she walked toward the jury. Her voice was calm but deliberate, her every word a hammer pounding against Ethan's and Paul's already fragile defense. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, pacing slowly, what we have here is not just a case of murder but one of cover-up, of lies, and of a family's utter collapse under the weight of its own secrets. Ethan Miller struck and killed his own mother in a fit of rage, and Paul Miller, his father, chose to hide Linda's body, erase her from existence, and shield his son from the consequences of his actions. This is not just unlawful, it is immoral. She pointed to the jury box, her voice growing sharper. We are not here to judge their grief. We are here to uphold the integrity of the law and to ensure that justice is done for Linda Miller, a woman whose life was unjustly taken. Paul's attorney, Robert Miles, leaned over and whispered to him, Keep your head up, Paul. Don't let them see you sweat. This is just their opening blow. Paul nodded ever so slightly, but his throat tightened. He didn't need the prosecution to remind him of what had been lost. Linda's face haunted him every night. The testimonies. The first person called to the stand was Detective Martinez, who had led the investigation. He described in painstaking detail how the police had uncovered the wrapped tarp in the Miller garage, how decomposition had already set in, and the overwhelming stench that made it impossible to mistake what they were dealing with. Photos of the crime scene were displayed on a projector, drawing audible gasps from women in the audience. Paul lowered his eyes, ashamed. "Mr. Miller," the prosecutor addressed Paul directly when they brought him to the witness stand, "you knew your wife was dead, didn't you?" "Yes," Paul replied, his voice a low rasp. "And instead of calling the authorities, you decided to, what, cover it up?" Klein's voice was cutting, her questions digging deeper. Paul's fingers gripped the edge of the wooden stand tighter. I wasn't thinking," he stammered. "My son was panicking. I thought I could protect him. He didn't mean to—" "Protect him?" Klein interrupted, her tone incredulous. "And in protecting him, you erased a woman who loved you and bore your children? Did it ever occur to you that Linda Miller deserved justice too?" Paul's mouth opened, but no words came. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye, though he tried to blink it away. Then they called Emily. Emily's testimony. All eyes fell on her as she walked to the stand. She was dressed conservatively, her hands clasped tightly as she sat down. She had tried to keep her composure, but the sight of her brother and father seated across the room made her heart break all over again. "Miss Miller," Klein began, stepping forward, her voice soft for the first time. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you, but I need you to help the jury understand something. Did you suspect anything strange before discovering your mother's whereabouts?" Emily straightened in her chair, taking a deep breath before answering. "Yes, my dad said she went to visit a friend, but she would have told me if she was leaving. That wasn't like her. And Ethan was acting so strange. I knew something was wrong. And you were the one who discovered the truth." Emily nodded, her throat tightening as the memory rose to the surface. "Yes, I found the tarp in the garage and I confronted my dad. That's when he told me what happened." Her voice cracked, but she fought to hold back tears. When Ethan's defense attorney Mark Reynolds stood up to cross-examine her, his tone was noticeably gentler. "Miss Miller, I know this isn't easy, but I just want to ask you one question. Do you believe your brother meant to kill your mother that night?" Emily hesitated, the air thick with tension. Her gaze flicked over to Ethan briefly before answering. "No, I don't believe he meant to, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't be held responsible for what he did." Ethan closed his eyes, her words cutting into him like a blade. The verdict. After weeks of arguments, evidence, and emotional testimonies, the jury finally convened to deliberate. The courtroom was tense when the foreman stood to deliver their decision. "For the charge of second-degree murder," the foreman began, clearing his throat, "we find the defendant, Ethan Miller, guilty." Paul closed his eyes, his head dropping. Ethan sat motionless, barely breathing, as the words hit him like a physical blow. "For the charge of obstruction of justice," the foreman continued, "we find the defendant, Paul Miller, guilty." The gasps from the gallery were drowned out by the sound of the judge calling for order. The sentence followed quickly. Ethan was given life in prison without parole, while Paul was sentenced to 20 years for his role in concealing the crime. A family torn apart. After the sentencing, Emily stayed in her seat as the rest of the courtroom began to clear out. Her father and brother were escorted out in handcuffs, their faces pale, their once strong bond now forever shattered. Paul turned to catch a glimpse of Emily one last time before the guards led him away. His lips moved as if to say, "I'm sorry," but no sound left his mouth. Emily just sat there, motionless, tears streaming down her face as her family disappeared from view. She stayed until the courtroom was completely empty. The silence that remained was deafening. For Emily, there was no real victory. Justice had been served, yes, but at what cost? She had lost her mother to violence, her father to his poor decisions, and her brother to his rage. All that was left was the deafening silence of a broken family and a life that would never be the same. Irrevocable consequences. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible scar, not only on the Miller family, but also on the tight-knit community they had called home for decades. The once idyllic suburban neighborhood with its neatly trimmed lawns and friendly block parties now seemed muted in color. The Miller house itself, a white colonial with green shutters, stood like a ghost of what it once was, a chilling reminder of the tragedy that had unraveled behind closed doors. For Emily, life became a fragmented series of before and after. Emily's struggle to move forward. Emily stayed at her dorm after the trial, not because she didn't miss her home, but because home no longer felt real. The memories there, family dinners, her mother's laughter as they baked apple pies, and even Ethan's goofy nicknames for her, had been poisoned by Linda's death and the lies that came afterward. Her college friends noticed the shift in her demeanor almost immediately. Emily, once the star of every debate, the first to offer a helping hand or a word of advice, had pulled into herself. She rarely smiled anymore, and when she did, it didn't quite reach her eyes. One day, Rachel, her roommate, tried to bring it up. "Hey, Em," Rachel said cautiously, sitting on the edge of her bed as Emily stared blankly at her laptop. "You've seemed, I don't know, a little off lately. Are you okay?" Emily tensed, her fingers tightening around the edge of her keyboard. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. Rachel frowned. Look, I know something happened with your family. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but—" "I said I'm fine," Emily snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Her chest tightened immediately with guilt, and she softened her tone. "Sorry, I don't want to talk about it, okay?" Rachel nodded slowly, backing down. "Okay. I'm here if you ever do, though, just so you know." Emily forced a nod, but in truth, she didn't know if she'd ever be ready to talk about it. How could she explain that her mother was gone, not in a way that was accidental or natural, but because her brother had killed her? And how could she explain that her father, the man who had given her piggyback rides as a kid and beamed with pride at all her accomplishments, had been complicit? Most days she tried not to think about it. She buried herself in her studies, her part-time job, anything that kept her mind busy. But at night, when the world quieted, the memories crept in. The sight of the garage, the smell of decomposition, the words her father had said, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." They echoed in her mind, over and over, until she fell into a restless sleep. The Miller house. Back in the neighborhood, the Miller house became a curiosity, a symbol of the unspeakable. Its green shutters began to fade, and the marigolds Linda had once lovingly planted in the front garden withered, untended. Children on bikes slowed as they passed by, whispering in hushed voices about the murder house. Their parents, meanwhile, whispered about their own guilt and obliviousness. "I can't believe we never knew anything was wrong," Joan, a neighbor, said one morning over coffee with another mom from the block. "We had them over for barbecue just last spring. They seemed normal." "No one ever thinks it's going to happen here," the other woman replied, shaking her head. "But something must have been broken in that family for years. You don't just wake up one day and—" She trailed off, not finishing the thought. The gossip only grew more intense when Ethan's sentencing made the local news. Journalists came knocking at doors, looking for former classmates or friends to comment on his character, but no one really wanted to say the quiet part out loud, that Ethan had been angry for years, and the signs were there. Paul's prison sentence. Paul, serving his 20-year sentence, spent his days in a loneliness he hadn't anticipated. Prison was loud, shouts, the clang of bars, the ever-present tension of danger, but inside his cell, it was suffocatingly quiet. He refused visitors at first. He didn't want Emily or anyone to see him this way. Her betrayal at the trial still stung, but it was a distant ache compared to the crushing guilt he carried. In the evenings he wrote letters to her, pouring out his thoughts, but he didn't send them. He'd start and stop reading over his clumsy scribbles and thinking, what good will this do now? One letter lay crumpled in the corner of his cell. "Dear Emily, I don't ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I know I failed you, your mother, and even Ethan. They say a father should protect his family, but all I seemed to do was destroy ours. I'm sorry." The letter ended there. Paul hadn't known what else to write. Ethan's life behind bars. For Ethan, prison was simultaneously his punishment and his escape. It was a world where no one knew Linda Miller for the gentle, nurturing woman she had been, and no one looked at him with the same raw disappointment that his family had. Still, it was a harsh, unforgiving life. He thought about his mother every day, replaying the moment he'd grabbed the whiskey bottle. He would lie on his bunk at night, staring at the cracked ceiling and whisper to himself, "I didn't mean it, I swear I didn't mean it." But in his heart, he knew it didn't matter. Intentions didn't bring people back. Emily's journey for closure. Months after the trial, Emily finally found the courage to visit the house again. The walk up the driveway felt heavy, her legs dragging as though a physical weight held her back. She hesitated at the door, her hand trembling before she turned the knob. The smell of dust greeted her, mixed with something faintly familiar, apple-scented candles her mother used to burn in the fall. She walked through the room slowly, each one a treasure chest of memories she wasn't sure she wanted to open. In the living room she found a stack of family photo albums, untouched since the trial. She sat down cross-legged on the floor and opened one. There was a picture of her as a baby, swaddled in her mother's arms, a wide smile on Linda's face. "I forgave you, Mom," Emily thought, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know it wasn't your fault, but she didn't forgive her father. And Ethan, she wasn't sure." By the time she left the house, the sun had begun to set. Shadows stretched across the quiet street as she locked the door behind her. She breathed deeply, her shoulders lighter than they'd been in months. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a start. The legacy of the Miller family. In the end, the Miller family became a cautionary tale, whispered in classrooms, sermons, and neighborhood gatherings. People argued over who was to blame. Was it Paul for enabling Ethan? Ethan for his reckless anger? The community for not noticing the fractures? Emily for speaking up? The truth was everyone carried a piece of that blame, and no one carried it more than Emily herself. Conclusion: the tragic story of the Miller family shows how unresolved family conflicts can only lead to a dark path.